Once again, I am in my classroom alone. There is no one else in here with me, hence no face mask, talking to myself. So last week on Friday, I believe we started talking about language and language in relation to culture. So language is fun because it's very different. Um, you know, cultures developed differently. They had different influences. They had different economic systems. So therefore, obviously, they put different emphasis on different words, how words are said, which words are important, and stuff like that. So moving on to the variations in contextual rules. So there are obviously communication differences, but we want to try not to stereotype because, not all Americans are direct and individualistic and straightforward and straight to the point. Because not everyone uses one style of communication all the time. And these are, our little styles like the elaborate, indirect, higher, low context. And people, they're individuals. They do things very differently in different situations. And styles definitely vary by context. So in a classroom, maybe you use more direct versus indirect communication. With your friends, maybe you're more indirect. It just depends. But we're just saying with a lot of these things in general, this is how this goes. But obviously, it's not all of the time when this happens. So when you switch between direct and indirect, particularly if you're going into different cultures, or when you are adapting to your audience. If you're in my speech class, you'll know that term. When you're adapting to the audiences or your other communication partners' style, you are doing what's called code switching. So this might be legitimately just switching between languages, or it might just mean switching between, okay, well, I'm talking in a very direct style with my friends, but I'm going home to my, Chinese family. Now I need to switch over into indirect style more so. But we have, it's very different, very variable on how people can communicate. So, and then obviously when people live between two cultures or multiple cultures, they have to switch between them. So, and we even do this with intergenerational. So we don't speak the same way to our grandparents as we do to our little cousins, because there's different lingo and different languages that we use, different slang. So, but one thing we have to ask ourselves is, how can we successfully communicate with all of these different types of people? Well, we want to avoid stereotypes. And we want to try to adapt to the other person like as much as we can to an extent. So if both parties are trying to adapt to each other, they can sometimes form like a third culture style is the term. So third culture style is when both people are trying to adapt to the language and communication style of the other, which might be a blend of both styles. So if you have a friend who is from another culture and maybe they speak very indirectly, you might adapt some more indirect styles of communication when you're talking with them, and they might adopt slightly more direct styles. And while neither of you might be, completely direct or indirect, you might have that blending of styles for your particular communication interactions with that specific friend. And I guess I could have just scrolled down and there it explains it. So third culture, you are adapting to each other into something that's not quite exactly the same as what you're used to. And then when you are interacting with someone who speaks a different language or is from a different culture, you might be doing what's called an improvised performance. Because like here in the US, we have a script, right, for how we greet people. If I introduce myself to Kyler, I go up, I shake his hand, I say, hi, Kyler, my name's Kylie, it's nice to meet you. That's our cultural script, right? But if we're not sure how this other culture does it, then we kind of have to make it up as we go. There isn't a ready-made script that we already just know, that we've been around for, 10, 20, 30 years of our life. And it just involves being flexible and trying our best. And if we accidentally do something wrong, we got to keep on trying, because we will mess up a million times before we get it right. Correct? And that is the end of that little section. And now we're moving on to language and power. So some of the things we're going to talk about here is language and social position, assimilation, accommodation, and separation. And these assimilation, accommodation, and separation are all things that can happen. Like if you move to a new country or move to a new culture, you can try to assimilate, you can try to accommodate, or you can try to separate. And we'll go over into those more specifically. So language and social position. So the language we speak is related to our social position. So here in the US, if you speak English, if you're a native English speaker, you tend to have a higher social position because you are a native speaker of the language that a majority of the people use in the US. English is not the US's official language. I don't think the United States has an official language. I just think we have English, which most people tend to speak in some way, shape, or form. But language and social position are used differently by these co-cultural groups. So our co-cultural groups are ones that are not dominant in society, but they exist within society. So skaters or master gardeners, co-cultures, or even could be a subculture. And then these individuals occupy different social positions within society. So in our social positions are social constructs that are embedded in gender, race, class, age, sexuality, all that fun stuff. But recognizing differences in social position is part of understanding communication, understanding how we communicate with other people. And our social position influences how we interpret the communicative context and communication and other people in general. So if we are a white male who is upper middle class, who is between the ages of 20 and 40, who is straight, we probably have a relatively high social position in the United States. Obviously, that'll vary depending on where you are in the US, or it'll vary depending on other countries. If you are a, bilingual Quebecois and English speaker living in Quebec, I'm pretty sure, yeah, because they speak like Quebecois, which is like a dialect of French, I believe. Then you probably have an advantage if you live in Quebec rather than if you just, are a English speaking American living in Quebec. So it depends and it varies. But how can we relate within our co-cultural groups to more dominant groups? Easiest way, talk to people. Because, when we talked about identity, we talked about how, you are not just one thing. For whatever co-cultural groups you belong to or subcultural groups, you do have other facets of your identity that tie you in with other people. So part of it's finding that understanding and where you do relate to people, even if, that culture or ethnic background is different. Because you can have people from all cultural backgrounds in your gardening club or your bowling league. So before we move on to the strategies for the co-cultural groups, we're going to talk a little bit more about power. But power is very important in communication. One of the first things we talked about in class was the 4 building blocks of intercultural communication, right? Culture, context, communication, and power. So power is a part of all of our conversations. Heck, when you're talking to your parents, there's that power in there too, because, you know, when you're younger, your parents have more power over you. And now as an adult, you have more equal power. We see that same power dynamic in society. If you are a native speaker of a language, if you are a native of a country, if you are in a majority dominant group, you have more power than someone who is maybe not a native speaker, not natively from the country, was not born there, or someone who is in, you know, whatever minority group or multiple minority groups. And it's not something that we always consciously think about what kind of groups or social positions that people occupy. It happens more subconsciously or unconsciously. And because that's just part of how we're raised. That's, you know, if you're a member of a dominant group, you are raised most generally in a certain way. And if you're a member of a minority group or in a particular social position or in a specific socioeconomic class, you tend to be raised in a specific way. And then we communicate in ways that support that particular perception of the world, particularly if we are in a group that has the power. Because just in general, if you have power, you don't really want to give it up. That's not to say the people who have power always abuse it. It's just saying, if you have some form of power, whether that be social power because of your social position, whether it be monetary power because of your socioeconomic status, people don't tend to want to give that up and risk dropping further down in the hierarchy. But if you're a member of a co-cultural group or a subcultural group that is not particularly dominant, you have to function and you have to an extent, adapt to how the people in power have structured society and have structured communication and have structured these interactions that you will have. And you either adapt to it or you maintain the way that it's been. So, but if you don't adapt, you can assimilate, you can accommodate, or you can pull away. And there's different ways of going about it. So if you are trying to assimilate your communication style into the dominant one, you are trying to become like that particular dominant group. So you're trying to fit in, be accepted. You might self-censor, you might avoid controversy. So non-assertive strategies, you might emphasize commonalities, self-monitoring, avoidance of controversy, like they're on the slide, I don't think, yeah. You might have more assertive assimilation strategies though, so you might downplay the differences between the two cultures. So very much a more forceful manner, but that might promote an us versus them mentality, and it might be difficult to sustain that assertive assimilation. You might experience burnout. And then the aggressive assimilation strategies. So you're emphasizing fitting in. So at that point, these people are going to very great lengths to prove that they are like the member of this dominant cultural group rather than a member of this co-cultural or subcultural group. So you could be disassociating, showing that you're not like whatever this particular group is. It could be mirroring. So dressing, starting to behave, starting to talk like members of a dominant group, or even self-ridiculing, self-depreciating humor, ridiculing other people or other members of your co-cultural group that you are, part of. And therefore you might not be seen as a typical or stereotypical co-cultural group member, but on that hand, or I guess on the other hand, members of your own co-cultural group might, make fun of you for being too insert dominant group here. You could try to accommodate as a member of a co-cultural group, so blending in. So you're adapting into the dominant group. So if it's non-assertive accommodation, you're blending in, but you might delicately challenge the dominant structure so that they recognize these co-cultural practices. So it could be increasing visibility of whatever your co-culture is. It could be trying to educate and dispel stereotypes. And some of the benefits, education, educating people, dispelling stereotypes, being able to actually influence decision-making of the dominant cultural group, possibly. So those are some good things. But then, of course, people might be like, oh, well, you're not being aggressive enough. You're not doing enough to help us. You're just, accommodating. But, sometimes major change is not terribly, it could cause conflict if you go for major change, like right out of the bat. But if you have assertive accommodation, you're trying to strike a balance between the co-cultural and the dominant group members. So communicating yourself and who you are, intra-group networking, so getting together with people from both of the groups, becoming a liaison between the two groups, helping them communicate more and learn more about each other, and of course, still education. And then if you're using aggressive accommodation, so becoming a part of the dominant group and then working through change from the inside. So you may be seen as confrontational or very self-promoting, so very much trying to become a dominant group member and then being like, okay, now we need to change how the dominant group does these things. But you are having a genuine desire to help both the dominant group and whatever co-cultural group that you are a part of. But obviously, if you're too aggressive, then you can cause separation or be alienated. And then our last one, so separation strategies. So you're trying to, in this case, remain separate from the dominant group. So if you are non-assertive separation strategies, so that would be used by people who assume that some segregation is part of the everyday life. So it's okay for people to be segregated or different or treated differently. So people might use this to just maintain that separation from the dominant group. They don't want to be a part of the dominant group. They might avoid interacting with dominant group members. If they use assertive separation, so it's a conscious choice to remain distance, to maintain space between it. So stressing the strengths of the co-cultural group and embracing some of those stereotypes. So using communicating self and intergroup networking to assist and assert separation. So like, doing the communication, but saying, no, we don't want to be a part of you. We want to still maintain our own thing. Like we don't want to, we'll interact to an extent, but we are not going to become like you. And then assertive separation strategies. So people who really want that co-cultural segregation. It's important to them, so they might attack or sabotage others who are trying to become accommodating or assimilate. So that's obviously pretty extreme, attacking or sabotaging. It could just be criticizing people for trying to assimilate. And then, of course, if they are trying to sabotage people who are trying to assimilate, they might risk retaliation from, members of the dominant group who maybe want the people to assimilate and become part of their culture and get to know them and interact more. Is there anything else I want to talk about in there? Nah. Okay. And then moving on back to more language stuff, because language is more fun than anything else, right? So languages, like I said, is fun. I don't know if I've asked in this class, but I might have. Actually, I think it was this class about how many people were bilingual or multilingual. There was a couple, but if you've never looked into learning a second language, personally, I definitely think that you should, because it helps your brain keep flexible, helps you earn more money, and it provides you insight to another culture. So people who are bilingual are people who speak two languages. So if you are bilingual, if you speak English and sign language, or if you speak English and Spanish, or if you speak Spanish and German, and you are multilingual if you speak more than two languages. So if you speak English, Spanish, and French, then you are multilingual. If you speak Chinese and Spanish and German, you are multilingual. But if you are bilingual or multilingual, very rarely do you speak with the same level of fluency in both. I've spent years learning Czech, and I am still nowhere near bilingual. English is my native tongue. I speak it so much better than I speak Czech. And there's actually a really cool video I have on multilingualism. I'll finish this out and then I'll show you guys that video just because it's really interesting, and like that kid is just nuts. But language acquisition is the art of, or the process of learning another language. But when you learn another language, you learn about the culture, and it's really hard to dislike people or dislike a culture when you actually know about them and learn about them. Yes, all cultures have things that are positive and negative about them, but it's hard to hold on to those stereotypes when you've been exposed to people from that culture when you are learning the language. So, and then translation, interpretation. So translation is just the process of producing a written text that refers to something said or read in another language. So books, easiest way to think about it, you have Harry Potter written in English, you have the Canadian version of Harry Potter that's been translated a little bit, you have the Spanish version of Harry Potter that has been translated over. So just you've taken one text from something and you have translated it over into another language. The source text is the original text of it. So in case of Harry Potter, it'd be English. The source text is in English. The target text might be Spanish. I'm trying to think of what the Czech title for Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone is. I'll remember it probably after class when I don't want to think about it anymore. I'm just like, oh man. And then interpretation, I had someone I think last year who wanted to be like an interpreter for like the UN, and that was pretty cool. But it's the process of verbally expressing what is written. So who wants to pretend to get arrested today? Probably no one. So let's say if I get, when I go over to Slovakia this summer, let's say I get arrested because I was climbing a chimney in Bratislava, okay? If I get arrested, the police would have to have an interpreter there because I do not speak Slovak, or I do not speak good enough Slovak to understand why I'm being arrested. So they would have to have someone there who would be live translating what the police were telling me about why I was arrested from Slovak into English. And then I would respond and the person would translate from English back into Slovak. that would probably be simultaneous interpretation to an extent. I mean, there'd be a little bit of a break because they'd have to think and translate. But there's also the consecutive, which is spoken during breaks. And I don't really think that difference is very important in my personal opinion, because it's all interpretation. It's just if it's happening immediately or if it's happening after the fact or during a break. But some of the issues with that might be, sometimes there aren't ways to totally translate something, or the words that you might use might not make sense in that specific context. So like the equivalency. So when you translate something, you want it to be equivalent to what it was originally, even if it's not word for word. You want the meaning to be there, even if the words are not the exact word for word translation, because then it might not make sense. Like a good way to think about it's like jokes and humor. They might not translate over well if you use exactly the same words it's translated, because it could be just like a pronunciation joke or whatever, a humor in the pronunciation. Anything else I want to talk about in there? Okay, I don't think so. Oh, I guess I will. But language, politics, and policies. So like I said, the United States doesn't actually have an official language. English is not the United States official language. We just don't have one. It is our de facto language, the one that we just kind of revert to. That's on all of our government documents, but that's because that's what most of the 320 million Americans speak. But if you look at Canada, Canada has two official languages. They have English and they have French, which means all of their government documents, all of their government websites have to be in both English and French. But a lot of Canadians speak French or Quebecois, that feels weird in my mouth, as a native language. So they have to have both of those. But when people or when governments are choosing official languages, that can reflect their history. It can say how they view other countries. So the US is a really big quote unquote melting pot. We have multiple languages spoken here by a lot of people. So we don't have a particularly official one, but if we did, our official languages would probably be English and Spanish, since we have so many native Spanish speakers here in the US as well. But if the US ever did make an official language, that could definitely cause some tensions to rise, because we haven't had one for 200 years. What's the reasoning? What's the political, what is the word I'm thinking of? Like, what's someone trying to get by adding one now? Yeah, so what would the motivation be? What political motivation would someone have to make English an official language now after 200 years? And then to wrap it up, actually, we're gonna have time. And then I totally forgot what we're gonna do on Wednesday. But as you think about language, all right, we're maybe gonna go to the library. But as you think about language and your intercultural skills, you don't have to be perfectly bilingual or multilingual in order to be an effective intercultural communicator. No, you just have to be flexible. You have to be adaptable. You have to understand that misunderstandings, they are going to occur. It happens. We all make mistakes. We all make a faux pas. We all accidentally offend somebody. It happens. And it's okay for it to happen. We just have to say, okay, well, when this happens, how are we going to react? And we have to be open to apologizing and saying that we made a mistake. If we did, or explaining what we actually meant, trying to make people understand. So we have to be conscious of how we use language, because sometimes we're saying things that we might not really understand the origin of. So like what we talked about last week with gypsy. If you don't understand where that comes from, you might be using it a lot. And if you come across someone of that particular descent and they get offended by it, then that's one of the things about like, oh, I didn't know where that came from. I'm sorry. Be aware of others' verbal messages and intercultural encounters. So just what people are saying. And people are not out to be buttheads. They're not out to offend you either. So if someone says something that makes you upset or offends you, just ask them to explain what they mean, because they probably meant something else and just accidentally said something that was offensive. People are not generally rude people. There are, but most people aren't. Practice expanding your language repertoire. So if you're going to go traveling, for example, try to learn a couple words in the local dialect, the local language, so you can try to communicate with people, or at least learn where is blank, and hello and thank you, kind of basic stuff like that, so you can do the general niceties, general politeness. Be flexible, be able to adapt to other people's language styles, because there's some, depending on what native language they speak, what kind of second language they learned, where their teacher was from, people can have some very interesting styles. And it's fun to listen to, it's fun to learn about. And then, you know, if people have specific labels that they want to use or not want to be used, try to be polite and refer to them in that particular way that they have asked you to. So, all right, and then I had that polyglot video, and then of course YouTube is going to copyright mark me. This one. I'm gonna actually stop the recording.